Recording in progress. Oh là là.
Schönen guten Abend, welcome, bienvenue à tout le monde pour notre visioconférence Ending FGM, Female Genital Mutilation in Literature and Art. My name is Joyce Mvuni. I'm the assistant of Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, one of the co-hosts tonight. And I will just give you some brief technical information. This webinar will be recorded. That is that all the persons that are presenting are also visible in the recording. The audience will not be visible. You can also send in questions via the Q&A chat on the bottom of your Zoom frame. And there's also the possibility to listen to the whole conference in French or in English. We have simultaneous translation. That said, I will leave you with Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana and Dr. Tobe Levin from Gleichen, who are hosting this webinar today. Thank you so much. Pierrette, you have to unmute yourself, please, and then we listen to you.
Okay. Voilà. Merci bien, Joyce. Bonsoir, bon après-midi, mesdames, messieurs, chers amis. Je suis très contente de vous souhaiter la bienvenue et surtout parce que vous assistez à cette visioconférence que j'ai préparée avec mon ami de très très longue date, le professeur Dr. Tobe Levin Freifrau von Gleichen. Et c'est pour moi vraiment un plaisir de retrouver des anciennes connaissances, des personnes, des expertes engagées depuis des décennies, qui ont écrit, je dirais, les premiers livres, les premières images, qui ont écrit les premiers documents, les premiers écrits. Et je tiens toujours à mentionner, entre autres, que le professeur Dr. Tobe Levin von Freifrau von Gleichen est vraiment la première femme, au moins en Allemagne, pour l'Allemagne, à avoir écrit un essai. C'était déjà en 1976. Vous voyez qu'il y a très longtemps. Donc, toutes ces personnes qui sont aujourd'hui avec nous, Madame Evelyn Akkad, j'étais très heureuse de lire à l'époque votre livre, je dois vous le dire, oui, et toutes ces personnes-là sont des experts connus dans le monde académique et de façon internationale. Je suis d'autant plus heureuse de savoir que nous avons réussi à avoir une modératrice, Samira, comme je vous appelle toujours, qui vient de l'Éthiopie et qui est en direct depuis l'Éthiopie, qui va faire donc la modération. Hilda Sachiko, qui a traduit mon texte à l'époque en japonais, il y a très longtemps de cela, Daniella Hasen et le professeur Elizabeth Bakers. Vous toutes, j'ai eu le plaisir de vous connaître d'abord par vos écrits et ensuite personnellement. Lorsque je dis que je suis très heureuse, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, nous avons en tout 250 personnes qui sont connectées et de nombreux pays d'Afrique sont là. Donc, je déclare ouvert la visioconférence et je vais faire une très courte présentation parce que j'ai envie de vous entendre, j'ai envie d'écouter ce que vous allez dire et mon allocution d'ouverture est pour cela assez courte. Alors, le sexe est, selon la sagesse populaire, la plus belle activité secondaire du monde. Lorsqu'on a ses règles, c'est agaçant. Mais les femmes doivent s'en sortir dans le cadre de leur fertilité féminine. Uriner ne vaut pas la peine d'être mentionné. C'est rapide. Dans les films, on ne remarque même pas lorsque quelqu'un va aux toilettes. Mais on devrait peut-être le faire, surtout lorsqu'il s'agit des mutilations génitales féminines. En effet, avec les mutilations génitales féminines, de tels actes qui nous paraissent tout à fait normaux pour nous, ces actes-là, qui sont aussi peut-être secondaires, deviennent dangereusement déterminants pour la vie en raison de la douleur et de la peur. Il est donc notre devoir de rechercher sans cesse un nouveau dialogue et de nouvelles formes pour mettre fin à cette tradition erronée, cette tradition qu'est la mutilation génitale féminine. J'éprouve toujours personnellement une certaine appréhension à aborder le sujet des mutilations génitales féminines et leur abolition, et pour lequel, comme je l'ai dit auparavant, je m'engage depuis des décennies. Et pourtant, je me réjouis de vous accueillir dans ce cadre et je vous remercie tous et toutes d'ores et déjà pour votre courage, votre intérêt, votre engagement, votre message et aussi votre ascension. Il est certes vrai que nous avons accompli de grandes réalisations dans la lutte contre la mutilation génitale des filles et des femmes, mais il reste encore beaucoup à faire. Notre conférence aujourd'hui me tient particulièrement à cœur, car la force de l'art et de la littérature, l'influence des formats médiatiques et des récits artistiques, les œuvres d'art pourraient être aussi la clé d'une approche plus progressiste, d'une approche interdisciplinaire. Le traitement des traumatismes déjà subis dus aux mutilations et la prévention absolue afin que de nouvelles excisions ne soient pas infligées aux filles et aux femmes sont au premier plan de notre travail à tous et à toutes. J'essaie à chaque fois de me mettre à la place d'une jeune fille qui, à cause d'une intervention traditionnelle, une coutume erronée, doit perdre une partie d'elle-même et cette partie-là, elle ne pourra jamais plus la connaître. Et cette tentative d'empathie avec la douleur et la honte d'une jeune fille excisée, blessée, m'incite encore toujours à élever la voix contre une violation des droits humains qui ne pourrait pas être plus flagrante et qui, en même temps, est toujours entourée de silence et d'invisibilité. Et depuis de nombreuses années, des décennies, je réfléchis avec vous à des stratégies qui permettent de lever le voile du silence et d'apporter de la lumière dans l'obscurité. J'ai chez moi des étagères remplies de livres qui, dans les années 60 et 70, ont réussi à aborder les mutilations génitales féminines sans pour autant sortir le sujet du mode de défense des conditionnements culturels. Des écrivains de renom, comme Gigi Wachongo, ont pris la mutilation comme thème central à cette époque-là. Et dans son roman The River Between, l'auteur en a fait un combat politique. Pourquoi? C'est qu'à cette époque-là, nous sommes dans les années 60, l'Église protestante au Kenya avait décrété ne plus admettre les enfants, garçons ou filles excisés dans ses écoles. Sous forme donc romanesque, Ngugi wa Thiong'o soutenait l'action du président Jomo Kenyatta qui s'était élevé contre la décision de l'Église protestante écossaise au Kenya. Cette mesure draconienne était perçue par les mouvements de libération comme un moyen de déstabiliser les militants. La circoncision et l'excision devenaient du coup un problème politique. Dans les années 80 et 90, je dirais, j'ai observé comment des féministes de différentes régions du monde ont lancé d'importants débats dans le cadre de la lutte pour la suprématie d'interprétation et comment elles se sont retrouvées prises au piège. Je pense aux grandes controverses que nous avons vécues lors de ce débat, tel celui de la conférence internationale de Copenhague en 1980, où un groupe d'activistes avait pris l'initiative de publier à la une des photos représentant l'intimité d'Africaines excisées sans consulter les femmes. Cette attitude avait été perçue comme un manque de sensibilité à l'égard des mouvements féministes africains. Les femmes du Sud, donc, ont été heurtées par cette attitude tutélaire qu'elles ont ressentie comme du maternalisme de mauvais aloi. Et même des romancières comme Feu Nawal El-Sadawi, dont les romans God Dies by the Nile ou Women at Point Zero où elles s'insurgent violemment contre les mutilations nationales, elles firent front pour attaquer un féminisme conquérant et inadapté aux aspirations des femmes du Sud. Depuis, beaucoup d'eau a coulé partout, que ce soit sous la Seine, sous le Niger, partout. Et je constate qu'à l'heure actuelle, de plus en plus de femmes courageuses racontent leur histoire, que les biographies et les autobiographies poussent littéralement comme des champignons et qu'elles créent un sentiment d'urgence et un flux de paroles inconditionnel. Ces dernières années, j'ai pu constater aussi qu'il y a eu au niveau politique un mouvement aussi positif pour nous, puisque des résolutions ont été votées. Les mutilations génitales féminines ont été reconnues comme un problème universel et le débat s'est assoupli de part et d'autre. Je fais, dans ce cadre-là, régulièrement entendre ma voix au niveau du Parlement européen. Et pour citer un exemple concret de mouvement politique, par exemple, afin de s'opposer résolument à la tolérance zéro que nous voulons et que nous souhaitons tous et toutes atteindre, le ministère fédéral allemand de la famille, des personnes âgées, des femmes et de la jeunesse a développé l'année dernière, en 2020, en collaboration avec d'autres ministères allemands et des organisations comme l'ESSON, une lettre de protection contre les mutilations génitales féminines afin de protéger les jeunes filles qui vont au pays durant les vacances. La lettre de protection est un document officiel du gouvernement allemand destiné à sensibiliser et à être utilisé de manière préventive afin de désigner les mutilations génitales féminines telles qu'elles sont, c'est-à-dire un crime contre les filles et les femmes. On espère qu'au niveau du Parlement européen, nous réussirons à convaincre les autres 27 pays afin que cette lettre-là aussi devienne la lettre pour l'Europe, pour au moins parvenir à cette abolition. Il y a un point qui, à mon avis, se perd étonnamment facilement dans tous les débats de niveau politique, médical et philosophique, car il s'agit d'un point de vue très fragile, voire sensible, celui de l'empathie, la compréhension empathique de chaque femme, de chaque jeune fille. Faire preuve d'empathie est un domaine sensible qui implique de quitter du moins en partie le niveau des simples faits et des discours. L'empathie révèle notamment sa propre vulnérabilité, sa propre peur et sa propre honte. Je pense toutefois que c'est précisément à ce niveau que la lutte contre l'excision des filles et des femmes doit être réajustée, ce qui pourrait être utile à toutes les personnes concernées. Et c'est là qu'intervient ce que nous avons parfois défendu et que nous allons défendre aujourd'hui. La littérature et l'art offrent à un individu un refuge, un lieu de retraite où l'on peut se confronter à sa propre intériorité, à ses propres conceptions et pratiques de la vie. Se plonger dans une œuvre d'art ou littéraire ou accompagner un personnage de roman à travers un récit sont des espaces-temps situés dans la fiction et au cours desquels la réalité personnelle peut entrer en échange avec une réalité imaginée. Et cette confrontation intérieure de celui ou celle qui lit ou qui regarde une œuvre d'art, comme nous le savons, a souvent un caractère révolutionnaire. L'art et la littérature possèdent une force énorme parce qu'ils permettent à l'être humain de se mettre dans un état comme si moi j'étais concerné, comme si moi cela me touche personnellement. Parce que la contemplation d'un tableau ou la lecture d'un livre peut déclencher une recherche intérieure et qui n'est pas contraignante. Et c'est de ce chemin, par la liberté et la force que portent la littérature et l'art, dont nous avons besoin pour nous rapprocher un peu plus de la fin de l'excision, de la fin des mutilations génitales féminines, des filles et des femmes dans le monde entier. J'attends avec hâte vos contributions et je vous remercie de votre attention. Merci. Je vais donc donner la parole à ma coéquipière, le professeur Dr. Tobe Levin Freifrau von Gleichen, dont j'ai mentionné tout à l'heure connu aussi dans le monde académique, qui est actuellement professeur associé à Hutchins Center, Harvard. C'est juste? Oui. Et pour vous toutes, vous la connaissez, nous avons tous lu ses écrits, tout ce qu'elle a fait, mais elle est aussi en Allemagne, peut-être que tout le monde ne le sait pas. Elle a créé Forward Germany en 1998, vous voyez, c'est-à-dire c'était la deuxième organisation qui a lutté contre les mutilations en Allemagne. Et je suis ravie de te revoir, Tobe. Ça fait tellement longtemps qu'on écrit ensemble, qu'on discute, qu'on parle. Et on s'est connus pendant d'abord une dizaine d'années. À l'époque, il n'y avait pas Internet, il n'y avait rien, par fax. C'est une très vieille amitié. Tobe, tu as la parole.
Thank you very, very much, Pierrette. I would say the same to you. Am I unmuted? Can you all hear me? Yes, you can hear me. Okay, good. That was very kind and generous, Pierrette, and I feel the same for you. It has been a couple of decades at least that we've been collaborators, and you were, of course, a co-founder of Forward Germany and the past president. So we are doing what we can. I'm going to give a speech of about 7 minutes, and I need to share my screen. So let's do it. Okay, I think we're getting there. Okay, so here we go. It is a great privilege to welcome you and express my gratitude to those who made this gathering possible. That is the German Green Party, Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, Joyce Muvunyi, and the Hutchins Center at Harvard, directed by Professor Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Executive Director Dr. Abby Wolf. Acknowledgement also goes to artists Godfrey Williams Okorotis, Imo Nakebe Manasa, and Olabunmi Temitope, whose works adorn this presentation. I'm further indebted to attorney Joy Keshi Walker, mother of a traveling exhibition against FGM called The Suffering, the Sorrow, the Setback, that launched in Lagos in 1998, and then circulated to more than 70 venues in Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and the USA before it experienced this final exposition at the University of Oxford recently. Thus, visual or verbal art nourishes our aim to keep girls safe. We wish to encourage departments of literature, theater, film, and media to embrace FGM studies. Since 1977, when a headline first showed me the blades, first introduced me to the blades, and I heard the appeal for help from a Sudanese survivor, I've included FGM in syllabi, but many colleagues have not, and this hesitancy must be addressed. To be sure, research into ending female genital mutilation, the official term espoused by the Inter-African Committee and UN agencies, has increasingly attracted attention in fields ranging from anthropology to medicine, law, and yes, even literary studies. Grassroots campaigns have benefited from parliamentary and European Union legislation. Inquiries have been launched, national action plans devised, and funds applied. Yet the cutting goes on in a practice that is complex, affective, and hydra-headed, involving historical processes, religious beliefs, money, and aesthetics. In one pithy proposition, Leila Hussein summarizes these hurdles. They say that UK residents don't like to talk about religion, race, or sex, yet FGM involves all three. Literature, however, dives right in. Sex, death, violence, and healing are its daily fare. Take the Talmud, the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, Krishna and the Pot of Butter, Arawilo in Legend and Life. Such bestsellers, whether of divine authorship or not, confirm the human passion for stories, rife with anthropomorphic protagonists and evildoers. After all, rare is the account of events in Africa that fail to include pageantry, song, dance, and theater. Despite the enchantment of stories, however, creativity, both optical and scripted, has been under-theorized by advocates against customary genital abuse. Granted, the move from empathy to action has yet to be proven. In her book, Empathy in the Novel, Suzanne Keene reiterates that a connection is assumed, but cannot be verified. Agreed. And yet, fiction domesticates the foreign, thereby taming it and making it accessible. With an antenna, it is hypothesized in one study of Sudanese soap operas featuring FGM, we can end these harmful rites. This pioneering webinar hopes to stimulate research into relationships among reading, empathy, and action. We embrace literary and media studies to encourage examining FGM as a theme, not only in classic genres, but also, for instance, in music lyrics, myth, graphic novels, comic books, art, advertising, as well as in contemporary modes of dissemination, tweets, blogs, Facebook, LinkedIn, and so on. In sum, literature and art are poised to supplement predominant social science approaches. Although Goodreads.com names more than 100 works of fiction and memoir, time prevents examining the list. Yet, giants for an emerging canon shouldn't go unmentioned. African novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Nuruddin Farah, Nawal El-Saadawi, Amadou Kourouma, and filmmaker Ousmane Sembène, for instance. Allies, too, whose witnessing inflects through the imagination, include Evelyn Akkad, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Fatou Keita, Jeannie Cardam, and perhaps unexpectedly, Nobel laureate Elfriede Jelinek in Die Klavierspielerin, that is the piano player, where excision stands for the silencing of women. Nor should a newer cohort of writers be ignored. Hilda Twangirwe will talk about Femrite, a pioneer gatherer of women's voices. Nick Hadikwa Mwaluko, who with a tempestuous drama called Wafrika, applies a rare queer, lesbian, and transgender sensibility to understanding FGM. Kiminta, an immigrant to Germany from Kenya, gives her survivor's story replete with solid policy advice. Laurelyn Bowen's Swimming in a Red Sea recommends itself for showing that the shibboleth of virginity inhibits any gender transformative approach. And finally, although an academic book par excellence filled with statistics and charts, In the Name of Tradition, FGM in Iran by Camille Amadi keeps personal testimony at its heart. People's stories, life stories count. Thus, we enlist memoirs for the movement. Declaring a right to bodily integrity, Arkadi's Mutilé, translated as Bloodstains. Nais Lengete's The Girls in the Wild Fig Tree. Soraya Mire's The Girl with Three Legs. Hiba Warder's Cut. Noura Abdi's Trainin im Sand. Katusha's Damashea, Dariatou Baz On m'a volé mon enfance, and Maïga Ka's La Voix du Salut. And there are, of course, many more. When authors' life stories touch biographies of readers, emotion promotes a visceral response and awareness that we can defeat the blades. I don't want to leave you without referencing creative avant-garde efforts I highly admire, including a commercial, an installation featuring vagina cupcakes, animations, and a YouTube sensation. So the last two slides give you a brief description and the URL. I'm not going to read them. If you'd like a copy of these and a literature list, simply leave your email on my website, which is www.uncutvoices.com. And that's what you will get. Thank you very much. And I too am very much looking forward to the presentations of our group of experts.
Thank you so much. Here I am again. And for everyone who hadn't seen me before, because it was right at the beginning, I'm the assistant of Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana. And I just wanted to say again, we are recording this event and you can also ask questions in writing. Actually, you have to go on the chat box on the down part of your Zoom. And that's just for the technical part. But I also have the pleasure to first of all thank the co-hosts for their speech, but also to introduce the moderator. And we're very happy to have Samrawit Petros with us today. She has been an advocate against FGM for over 15 years now in Ethiopia, but also in Germany. And she grew up in a rural area in Ethiopia and studied gender development studies, and has always been a storyteller through art, also especially with those topics related to justice. I cannot explain everything she did and does because it's a lot, but I just wanted to bring your attention to a photo exhibition she did, which was called Strings Attached to Female Genital Mutilation, which actually also had the same goal, a little bit like this event today, to open spaces to negotiate, understand, or be empathetic towards what those women feel, want, and how they understand their autonomy. Samira has also been in Germany for some time. She exhibited with other photography artists like Fabrice Montero, Lula Kezuya, Eric Otieno, curated, etc. I will stop here and leave the word to Samrawit. I'm very happy that you're with us today. I'm very happy also that we have such brilliant minds here today and so many women as well. Only, huh? Wait. So I can only say, have a good conversation, interesting discussions, and we will listen closely to what you have to present. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for introducing me in such a very honorable way. I'm very, very delighted to be here with all the phenomenal women that are in the room. I hope everyone is hearing me well, since we did a great technical test. Thank you so much, most of all the hosts that have organized this event. It is a dream for us as an FGM advocate to be here today to discuss art and ending female genital mutilation in art and literature, that it's here risen by such influential and phenomenal collective. I highly believe that this will really bring a big influence and will stir up discussion to influence further for further discussions that would hopefully lead into good results. In my photography pieces and in my advocacy, this is what I have been trying to do, but today it's here in the room in the European Union discussed. And for this, my gratitude goes to Pierrette, Dr. Pierrette, who has been advocating age-old this topic in Germany and elsewhere, and today also in the European Union. I'm very, very thankful for that, and also for the co-host, Dr. Tobe, and for all of you, as also my colleague, the assistants of the MPE, Joyce Mivuni. I'm very, very happy for all the work you have done. Now I will go directly introducing the presenters. And for the audiences, I want to say that we're very delighted to have really a huge amount of audience listening today, and we encourage you to ask questions and send us questions in the chat box. after each, once the presenters started to present. And also we would like to say that this topic is quite a heavy topic, and unfortunately the time is short. So each and every perspective and dimension that would be raised into the discussion would really further enhance and enrich the input that comes together in influencing further the productivity of the discussion. I'm very happy for all the artists and for all the highly literate people that will present today. So our first presenter will be Evelyn Akkad, who is a child of parents from Swiss and also Lebanon, who has a PhD in comparative literature from a later institution, and who's also a professor and specializes on the Francophone, Arabophone, African, Middle East women's studies and comparative literature at the University of Illinois, and who has published her first novel, Les Excides, and which was translated in English as Exercise in 1989. The novel deals with excision of women, both physically and metaphorical senses. So she will be our presenter next.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, for this introduction. And I'm really so happy to see Tobe and Pierrette finally, and so happy to be among you all. It's amazing to see that. When I started being interpellée, I mean, moved by this topic, I was a student in at the University of Indiana. I was writing my dissertation on the literature of North Africa and the Middle East. And I didn't know anything about it. I had run away from practices also oppressing women in Lebanon because I wanted to be free and find out who I was. But reading about this, I happened to read a book by an Egyptian doctor who said the sexual drama of the Arab woman. His name was Yusuf al-Masri. It was the first time I had read or heard about this practice. And it made me so sick and so upset that I decided to introduce my dissertation with a chapter, including a chapter on the practices that oppress women, including that practice. And I can tell you it didn't go very well, especially with one. At the time, we didn't have many women as direct, you know, it was in the early 70s, 72, 71, 73. And it didn't go very well with one of the male professors, an Arab professor, who told me it has nothing to do with literature. Why are you including this topic? And he wanted me to remove it. Luckily, I was supported by my other members of the committee, but I had to fight to mention it. And I became very aware of the harsh condition that women live and how terrible it is. And I couldn't sleep at night because of it. In fact, I even composed a song later, but even this novel was already in my mind when I wrote L'Excisé, which I wrote during those years, those first in the early 70s. And I didn't know at the time, it wasn't talked about very much. And I didn't know that that was the time when Nawal Saadawi was also talking about her own excision, her own genital mutilation. And the this novel was already in my head, and L'excisé is not only about the physical mutilation of women, but it's also about the mental mutilation of fanatic religion, which I was suffered so much from in Lebanon, fanaticism of religions. So I decided to write this novel, but not knowing that it was it was not talked about very much now it's talked about more, and luckily I feel so thankful that luckily there has been so many novels, so many talks, so many, and this I hope brings in more awareness also. But at the time it was a kind of a taboo subject, and I had a hard time even publishing my novel. And this novel that deals with both the physical and the mental was also something that I took when I gave conferences. And I remember being torn apart in one of the conferences in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was discussing this topic. And one of my male colleagues was saying it's tradition, and I was telling him no, it's mutilation. And we were on a plenary session. What happened and upset me very much was that the audience got divided along racial lines and not gender lines. In other words, the African women were siding with the men in the room. And I even remember one of the African women stood up and she said, in Le Boubou, it was in those years, you know, the 70s. And she stood up and she said, "Je suis fière d'être mutilée. I'm proud to be mutilated." So I was very depressed and discouraged. But in the evening, there was a poetry session, and I sang my song on genital mutilation, which I will end with shortly after this too. And the same woman who had stood up in the morning had tears in her eyes. Many of the women there had tears in their eyes. And she came to me, and they came to me afterwards, and they said, "Thank you, Evelyn, for bringing awareness to this topic. But you see, in front of the West, we have to side with the men of our race." So this topic of loyalty against justice or loyalty against truth has been a topic that has really made me question a lot of things. And it's one of the chapters in one of my books and studies. So I will maybe now end, because we don't have very much time and I'm looking forward to the questions. I will end with my song on genital mutilation. And it's a song that, because I write in French, the words, I mean, but so I will give you a quick translation in English. It says, on the plane they are advancing, one by one they are advancing, unconscious of the grip, unconscious of the knife, unconscious they are advancing. I can no longer sing, I can no longer dance, I can no longer kiss you. My kiss is veiled in the purplish blue blood, in the stop put on their ecstasy. On the plane, the blood is flowing and the women are screaming while remembering the age of shame when they went under the same knife on the same plane. I can no longer color your paintings with pastels. I can no longer sing the song of love. My joy is blocked in the screams shrieked, in the tied up hands, the spilled blood, the crucified childhood, in the stop put on their ecstasy. plaine, elles avancent, une à une, elles avancent, inconscientes de l'étau, inconscientes du couteau, inconscientes, elles avancent. Je ne peux plus chanter, je ne peux plus danser, je ne peux plus t'embrasser. Mon baiser est voilé du sang violacé, de l'art est posé sur leur extase. Ouh, 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 ouh. Dans la plaine, le sang coule et les femmes crient en se souvenant de l'âge de la honte quand elles ont passé sous le même couteau dans la même plaine. Je ne peux plus colorer ton tableau de pastel, je ne peux plus jouer la chanson de l'amour. Ma joie est bloquée dans les cris poussés, dans les mains liées, l'enfance crucifiée, dans les dos posés sur leur extase. Ouh, 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 ouh.
Wow. Thank you very much. This is, of course, very deep and very moving. And I think the whole room is now touched and very stirred in their emotions. And let's now pass maybe the floor to them so that they can ask us questions and also process then their feelings through that. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. We appreciate it. So dear audiences, now we're back to you and we'd love to encourage you to ask questions. Also participants and panelists can indeed ask their questions. So I'm waiting for you. Okay, so maybe we should move to the next presenter. By then we will have more questions coming. I will be presenting now Hilda Wungurue, and of course I pronounced her name wrong. So is a graduate at the Makerere University, juggles life as a mother and development worker, writer, and editor. She's also a founder and founding member of the Femret, Ugandan Women's Writers Association, and she has also received a medal from the Ugandan government for her outstanding work and contribution in emancipation of women through literature and art. So now the stage is yours. Thank you so much for presenting. You're probably muted. Would you please unmute yourself? Okay, maybe we should write her.
I've lost my time. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm so delighted to be in this space, speaking with you, speaking with the rest of the presenters and our audience about female genital mutilation, one of the most oppressive, dehumanizing cultural practice against womankind. Femright, as Dr. Tobe already commented about it. We were established in 1995, and we have different programs in writing, in reading, and most of our programs focus on women, but we also have programs where we have men, because we rep organization, because we wanted the women to take up their space on Uganda's literary landscape, because at that time it was really mainly men playing and dancing to their own tune. So we operate in Uganda, but we also have programs which are regional for African women writers. And we really appreciate those regional programs because they have kind of created a sisterhood. Femwrite has created a sisterhood around African writing, and we feel that that is something beautiful that we should take into the future. In 2016, as we were celebrating 20 years of existence, we hosted we had a literature conference, which we did in partnership with the School of Women and Gender Studies. And we had a guest speaker, one of our keynote speakers, Professor Pumla Dineo-Gola from South Africa. She said something interesting. She said, writers are warriors. And indeed, while some people riot with stones and bottles and fire on streets, writers riot with pens. Femwrite women have for over 2 decades rioted with their pens, contributing to social and political debates and to the policy environment in the country. Although at inception, we were looking at bringing women together to write, later the landscape changed and we got into other things. We got into teaching other people to write. We got into activism, women activism. We got into literary activism. We got into different things. The space was open. And today, the organization has published a lot of creative fiction. We have produced fiction, creative nonfiction, which speak to issues of national concern, including those pertinent to women, women's emancipation and dignity. When the previous speaker was talking about how someone stood up and said, I am proud to be this, it reminded me of my own sentiments when I first heard of female genital mutilation. And so when we started thinking about doing creative nonfiction, it was one of the themes that we started with. And we said, we have to do some literature to address this. And at that time, there was a lot of debate in Uganda. Some women from Eastern Uganda. In Uganda, FGM is practiced mainly in the eastern part of Uganda in about 6 districts. So the public was speaking about it, but in mamas. And so we said, no, in order to contribute to making this public, let's do books. So we got women and we went down and to Eastern Uganda and we interviewed women. It was a courtship of sorts because they were not willing to speak at the start. The women spent there many days trying to get the stories. And then later we did a novel. One of our writers wrote a novel titled The Switch by Mary Karoro Okrut. The anthology of the true life stories is titled Beyond the Dance. I will share in the chat later in case people want to look at them. But when these stories came out, people came to us and said, these stories are too sad. You need to write positive stories. And we said, yes, they are sad, but we have to write them as well. They are our stories and we need to write them, deal with them in order for us to move forward. We cannot pretend and say, because this is sad, we can't deal with it. So that is how we've been pushing. And then in doing both fiction and creative nonfiction, that the aim was so that we have, you know, we have, if one can't read a novel, then they can read a short memoir. Then they can read a short story, then they can read a poem, and somehow everybody will get involved in this conversation, in this public conversation, so that we do not leave anyone behind. And some of the poems in Beyond the Dance are really short. And I want to read for you one poem written by Aral Sophie Brenda. She paints a picture of circumcision blades over the persona's head, and she writes, the blades of the community, they hang above me as if the culture steeped in them should start falling furiously over my head as I walk these heavy heels. So Aral positions the FGM blades not just as a matter of something that affects the genitalia, but something of mental health as well. Our hope, therefore, in doing such is that such literature goes into schools where girls can access the stories. In Uganda, I don't know how it is in your settings, but in Uganda, most of the reading takes place in schools. So most of the time, books outside the school system do not get read. When The Switch came out, even Beyond the Dance, politicians bought so many copies and donated to schools back in their homes. But our question is, if the politicians or just well-wishers buy these books, do they get into the system? Do they get to be part of the mainstream discussion? And so that is one of the reasons why we end up moving from writing into activism, literary activism, advocating book policies and literature policies that would then support the work that we are doing the other side. And memoirs, we believe memoirs are really crucial, as the previous speakers have said, because they carry truth. Literature is crucial because it carries imaginations of truth. Women cannot make the right decision. Women in the rural areas, young women who are being targeted in Uganda, it is between 11, 12, even 10 to something like 40. So that they cannot make the right decisions with no truth or with half truths. And so that is why it is very important that these stories get written and get into the public, get into mainstream reading spaces. why in our interviews, I actually participated in doing some of the interviews. I have 2 stories in Beyond the Dance, which I co-wrote with my partner, with my friend. And one of the things that they keep pointing at why FGM thrives is the silence, the lack of knowledge, the peer pressure, the cultural reverence. But the silence in Uganda, in Eastern Uganda, has been one of the drivers. And so we believe that literature plays a big role in dismantling that. We hope also that the lawmakers, the policymakers get to read these stories. When they came out, we donated a number of copies to our parliamentarians, the women parliamentarians, and we hope that the literature, the understanding the topic better contributed. That was in 2009. And in 2010, very fortunately, an act of parliament came out prohibiting FGM in Uganda. That's when it came into force. But even before that act of parliament, our constitution of the Republic of Uganda, it speaks to, to no torture and no circumcision. Is there any worse torture than circumcision? Yeah. And so these laws are there. So what we have to also, in addition to laws, we have to really strategize on how to implement what the laws are saying. I thank you very, very much, and I look forward to the conversation. For God and my country, and on behalf of FemRight, we pledge to do our part. I want to thank Dr. Tobe. She has co-published one of our books, Beyond the Dance, and also another outfit in the US. They also took Beyond the Dance and co-published it under Lawrence Hill Books. Although they don't have female genital mutilation, the editor said, this is all torture. Torture goes on in different forms. And so it is co-published under Lawrence Hill Books, if you're interested. I thank you.
Thank you so much. We also thank you for your great presentation and for the effective use of time. Now that we have to proceed, I might have to stop you here and proceed. Yes, thank you for the questions now, so that we can have more time for the audiences to ask. Before we go to the entire before we take many questions, I think we will just be selecting 2 questions from what has been raised so far from the audience. I think I would like to ask the first question to Evelyn. You are asked if this song have been played in Africa before, and if it is on social media. So that would be my question for you from the audience.
Yeah, very good question. I'm working on it, on having a more professional recording of it so I can sing it in Africa. I'd love to. I have a very talented young Lebanese friend in Lebanon with a beautiful voice, and we're working on doing things together like that. And I have been singing it usually in conferences. You know, I like to mix medias. I find it more effective, as we just discussed. And it's...
Can we find it on social media and on YouTube?
You might find it on YouTube, but, you know, not very professional versions, you know.
Thank you very much. Again, a question from the audience is that this is a question that I've been receiving several times whenever I moderated or whenever I exhibited my FGM photos as well. And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this question. The question goes like this. So as women themselves encourage violence against women, particularly FGM, how to stop and tackle this challenge is a question. So if anyone would like to answer this shortly before we proceed to the next discussion, please.
Can I give a quick answer?
Yes, sure.
I have one of my ex-students, Molly Melching, some of you might know, in Senegal. She went on the Peace Corps, and she worked with all the various politicians, religious leaders, women, activists, and drew a big movement against this practice, and it has been very successful with an organization called Tostan, I think, very successful. And they've almost reached, you know, excellent results.
Thank you very much. All right, Hilda, what do you have to say? Maybe if you have another perspective on this question.
Sorry?
Yes.
Sorry, I missed that.
If you have another perspective on this question, please, I would like to give you the chance. Should I repeat the question maybe?
Yes, please.
Yes, so as women themselves encouraged violence against women, of course, particularly FGM, how to tackle this problem or how to stop it, since women themselves feed into the violence?
I think it's not real. What we see from behind the curtains is that they are encouraging violence against them, against each other, against themselves. But that is what I'm going to use the term patriarchy, but that is what patriarchy does. It will set you against one another and you won't even recognize it. Yeah. And so I really think that once the women have the information, once the women interact and get into spaces where they understand more about their oppression,
I can't hear you.
There has been a cut, I think.
Yes. So, okay, then maybe we will come back to this question after next presentation, or quite in the end, because it's the time is going and I couldn't hear the last answer. So our next presenters are two presenters, Ruhina Jasmine, an associate professor who has been teaching English language and literature since 2021, who has published different journals and researches that focus on Alice Walker's novel and intersect race, gender, and sexuality studies, and who's also assistant at the Unicut Voices and is highly also influenced by Alice Walker's Possessing the Secret of Joy. So she, and of course together with Shiko Mitsuri, they will be presenting us next. So as Shiko Mitsuri also is teaching at the Hiroshima University in Japan and has published a book in 2019 called An Interpretation of Walker's 7 novel based on her doctoral thesis, and is a member organization of WAF, Women's Action Against FGM Japan. So they would be presenting us next and the stage is theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Samrawit, for giving me the floor. This is Ruhina from Queen University, Bangladesh. Okay. So, Pulitzer Prize-winning African-American novelist Alice Walker creates an ample room of her own for further exploring the afterlives of the past. Through Walker, fostered the paradigms of the present and vice versa. She uncovers continuity of privileged women's sufferings through that she's frequent surfacing in Walker's iconic novels. Alice Walker builds her narratives intermingling past and present to reaffirm Black women's connection to each other, re-establish their connection to their ancestors, and to create wholeness of women's characters, selves, and community identities. Walker's characters muster strength to shatter socio-culturally imposed normativity and or performativity, and strive for attaining wholeness amid intersectional operations. This is truly transgressive and humanist. It is also performative and significant in a sense that it remains the cornerstone of Alice Walker's humanist ethos. Well, Alice Walker brings Tashi, including the issue of female genital mutilation, as a central motif in 3 consecutive novels, such as 1982, The Color Purple, 1989, The Temple of My Family, and 1992, The Possessing the Secret of Joy. Walker's telling of Tashi's Fgm in Color Purple, reinclusion and retelling of Tashi in her next novel, The Temple of My Familia, a rewriting of Tashi's harrowing tale of her mutilated genital and tortured soul in Possessing the Secret of Joy, a portrayal of Tashi as a fighter and survivor of Fgm explicitly manifests intertextual connections among these texts. Tashi is the representative of millions of unprivileged women who undergo the horrific practice. Tashi kills the mutilator, Melissa, and admits to her sister-in-law, Olivia, that she has not killed her mutilator in the name of the suffering that she has caused to her. In fact, she dearly cherishes the community does. It makes Tashi a true humanist who possesses the power of resistance and makes both the mutilator and the mutilated free from performing and undergoing a lifelong pain of Fgm. The racist, sexist Olinkan government executes Tashi for her violation of social, cultural, and political norms. It clearly reveals the proliferation of an intersectional power dynamics. On the eve of Tashi's execution, Pierrette, along with others, carries a banner which shows the word resistance underlined and also written in block letters. They stand together as part of their protest against the execution of Tashi. It effectively communicates Alice Walker's attempt to promote worldwide feeling in favor of the human rights of the women that stand against Fgm. Walker's writing reflects transgressions which manifest itself in its progressions. Her literary pieces play significant roles in their best efforts to end Fgm. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Shiko?
Okay, so thank you for having me for this wonderful opportunity. So I should share my presentation. So, please. Okay. Right. So, yeah, first, today, I'd like to talk about the effect that Alice Walker's novel, Possessing the Secret of Joy, has had in Japan since the novel was published in 1992. Ms. Yumiko Yanagisawa. Miss Yumiko Yanagisawa, the famous Japanese translator, published the Japanese translation of Possessing in 1995. Also, in 1995, she joined the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, where African Americans appealed for global support to abolish FGM. In the background of Ms. Yanagisawa's crucial determination to start an organization, there was a close connection between two important things in her life: literature and social engagement. Then, in 1996, just 1 year after her Possessing translation, Ms. Yanagisawa founded the first Japanese organization against FGM. The organization was named Women's Action Against FGM Japan, WAF. Since 1996, it has been publishing 2 newsletters a year, giving workshops at annual events and at several colleges, and having discussions online, especially this year, for more people to learn about both the physically and mentally harmful practice on women. Unfortunately, the practice of FGM is still unknown to most Japanese people, but people who hear about WAF, regardless of their gender, usually say, "How can I do something for ending FGM?" And sometimes they become a member of WAF. As a staff member of WAF, I also have been influenced by Walker's Possessing. In 2019, I published a book based on my doctoral thesis, an interpretation of Walker's 7 novels, the transformation of the powerless to the resistant. In the 3rd chapter of the book, I discuss Possessing the Secret of Joy by focusing on the words of a white European psychiatrist called Muze. Muze meets Tashi, the female protagonist whose genitalia were mutilated. At first, he tries to find the reason of her agony as a doctor, but eventually he realized that what was done to Tashi is something that is also done to him. He calls such a human bond a truly universal self. Walker shows the importance of solidarity by his achievement this universal self. Most importantly, Tashi also finds her own universal self, even though she's going to be executed by the government for the killing of her circumcision. She thus becomes the symbol of women's freedom. Possessing strongly tells us that finding a universal self in your own mind is the beginning of the movement against FGM. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. I will be presenting our last 2 panelists, and then we will proceed to the questions. So next is Daniella Hasen, who has published on FGM in the context of human rights, gender and development, culture and anthropology, as well as African literature. She has taught, for example, at the Humboldt University in Berlin, University of Constance, as well as University of Tübingen, offering courses on FGM and in gender studies, cultural studies in different languages, also in English, and has brought the issue of FGM in classroom. She will be presenting, and next we will have also Professor Dr. Elizabeth, who is also a senior lecturer at the British and Postcolonial Literature in Department of Linguistics, and also who has published her book or is an author of Raising Athletes in African and African American Writing on FGM. They will be presenting us. The stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Samrawit, for this very kind introduction. And thank you to all of the organizers, Tobe, Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, Joyce, and everyone else who's making this possible today. I have to share my screen. Yes, there we go. Yeah, I would like to start my brief introduction, my brief input on introducing FGMC in the classroom with a quote by Soraya Mire. I have to see. I try to move it down, but it's not. Okay. Oh, okay, let's do it like this. Was published her memoir, The Girl with 3 Legs, in 2011. Quote, my work as a survivor of a cultural act of violence, pain, and betrayal then is to never forget what happens to women and girls. My duty is to voice the hidden struggle of women who have been tortured. There is no power greater than finding the strength to go into the world and do the work you have been put on earth to do. That is why writing the book was important for me. I have decided to focus on activist life writing, not only because it has ending FGMC at its center, but also because I believe that it facilitates students' engagement with practices of genital mutilation. From my experience of teaching several courses with a focus on FGMC, I can say that this is a challenge. Responses by students, especially those who encounter the issue for the very first time in their lives, include silence, shock, anger, and withdrawal. Students appear insecure, and some do not manage to address issues of sexuality, or they feel uncomfortable to even mention female genitalia. In addition, some students make strong claims that FGMC has been discussed in an utterly racist way in Western countries, both in texts and pictures, and they argue that they are not in a position to speak for African women, or that it would be best to leave the topic alone. Conflicting identities, such as those of being a critical student scholar and an activist, add to the picture because these identities appear to be irreconcilable. All of these responses are understandable and need to be taken into consideration when preparing courses on FGMC. I especially take the racist and colonialist undertones of some of the writing on the subject very seriously, as I see my teaching not only in the context of gender justice, but also in relation to the decolonization of knowledge production at universities. I argue that activist life writing, such as the memoir by Soraya Mire, but also books by Fadumo Cohen, Nahal El-Sadawi, and others, can help enormously to address the teaching challenges just mentioned. Most importantly, activist autobiographical books offer ways of identification which might help students to overcome passivity, acquire the ability to find their own voice, and at best move on to become activists themselves. What are some of the features that characterize activist life writing or memoir? First of all, the writers self-position themselves as survivors of FGM, mostly infibulation. They present FGM as a gender-specific human rights violation and, not surprisingly, choose a language that supports their activist goals. Soraya Mire, for example, deliberately uses words like mutilation and child abuse to make her point. Another feature is the discussion of the dangers and challenges that arise in connection with activist work, such as death threats or other threats that compromise the safety and well-being of activists. In the case of Mire, we can also read of a highly complex and I would say abusive mother-daughter relationship characterized by devaluation and lack of interest on part of her mother, who appears to be deeply traumatized herself. Ostracism by her family, including the termination of financial support, while Mire is a student in France and later an activist in the United States, are all life writing, are additional issues that characterize her memoir. While some of these features appear in virtually all life writing on FGMC, the extent to which activism is discussed in the book makes Miris, The Girl with Three Legs, differ from other books which do touch on the issue of activism, but in which it is not the larger frame in which the text is written. In the following, I would like to give suggestions for topics that could be addressed when teaching Soraya Miris, The Girl with Three Legs. First, I suggest looking at the different forms of autobiographical writing and their relationship to the political empowerment of its subjects. This includes an analysis of whether and to what extent FGM memoirs such as Miris relate to other autobiographical forms such as the slave narrative, the testimonial, or the autobiographical manifesto. Generally, I would like to caution, however, against teaching FGM life stories solely as cultural texts, but rather suggest doing both, reading them as literary works in their own right and as cultural texts that shed light on the various discourses surrounding FGMC. Since in Miris' book, trauma is such a central issue, both personal and intergenerational, it is helpful to guide students to undertake a narrative analysis and to pay attention to how the story is narrated, including things such as narrative perspective, literary time, literary setting, and order. That is, whether we have a straightforward rendering of events or whether the story has gaps and or repetitions. Another important field are the cultural aspects surrounding FGMC in Somalia. Life stories are therefore useful not only for presenting rationales for FGMC, but also for providing explanations for ideas about body image, female sexuality, family relationships, or ways to eradicate genital mutilation. In order to include legal perspectives, one could examine central concepts of human rights and how they are framed in Miris' texts, most prominently bodily integrity and dignity, and put them in relation to the legal wording and discussion of such issues. The medical gaze, which mutilated women are subjected to, the medicalization of FGMC in urban and or upper class settings, and the problematic encounters of FGM survivors with gynecologists in Western countries are equally important topics for the classroom. Finally, literary criticism pertaining specifically to life writing and fiction on FGMC can guide students in examining a particular text in relation to other writing on the issue. Comprehensive studies like those by Elizabeth Bakers, who is a presenter today, and Chantal Sabu are immensely helpful in this respect, as are texts by Tobe, Levin, Rohina, Jasmine, and generally all of the presenters who are here today. Finally, I would like to share some take-home messages that we could convey to students, or that I consider important to convey to students. First, FGMC is a fundamental violation of the bodily integrity of women and girls, their right to healthy living and personal fulfillment. Second, human rights are a valuable good to defend despite ongoing and justified critique from scholars and activists. And those of you who are dealing with the human rights debate, they know that there is a whole set of criticism that has come up during the past years, coming from different angles about why the human rights discourse and human rights practice has faults and shortcomings. And still, I would say we need to adhere to this concept of human rights. It's very important. Third, cultural context is important to understand FGMC, why it is practiced, and to envision ways to eradicate it. However, culture is not an excuse for FGM itself. Respect, empathy, and a commitment to anti-racist work are key in supporting women who struggle against FGMC. And finally, FGMC should not be isolated from other issues that violate the bodily integrity of children, such as intersex surgery or male circumcision. Build bridges with other marginalized groups. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now we have Dr. Elizabeth Bakers next.
Should unmute. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you very much for welcoming me today and for organizing this very important panel. I think it's really important that we talk about this, and I would like to share my thoughts on this. Oops. Sorry, Yeah. This, as Daniela mentioned, this is based on my research that I did for my doctoral study, and I published this in 2010 in Rising Anthills. What I concluded after looking at a whole range of texts is that female genital excision is rarely the central theme, but it has been continuously addressed in Europhone African literatures since their rise in the 1960s. And it was largely ignored in literary criticism until the 21st century, which was quite different from the way that this practice was received in debates by debates at large, and also the huge interest in life writing. So literature has lagged behind a bit, but I really feel that it's important to look at literature directly at voices from Africa and the African diaspora. The writing that I looked at was all written in European languages or available in translation. That's due to my own limitations. So the rest of my talk, I really focus on Europhone literatures. So I apologize for not including anything else apart from some Arabic texts which were translated into English. The works are written by established authors. Some of them have been mentioned, but also lesser known writers, and from across the African continent and the African diaspora. Mainly novels, but a lot of short stories, plays, and poems as well. And on this map, you see the spread of the practice, and that really corresponds to the spread of the authors as well. That means that the authors who write about female genital excision hail from different geographical regions, different ethnicities, different language groups, different religions. The corpus of texts on excision also reflects the changes in African literatures since the 1960s. So an interest in the anti-colonial struggle at the beginning, and then independence and the disenchantment that follows, the rise of feminism, human rights activism, growing tensions in the diaspora, but also literary developments, the rise of women writers and Black writers in the diaspora. Whether it's a motif or a central theme, it is rarely used just by itself or addressed by itself. It's always used to raise broader issues. And even within a single text, various issues or various conflicting discourses can be used, so that it's clear that there is a huge nuance also within a single text. The complexity of the debate is shown within a single text. Different discourses are used, the traditional discourses about the entry into womanhood, so a female rite of passage. In the colonial period, we see the anti-colonial discourses, the focus on ethnicity. The practice becomes a marker of the identity of the ethnic group. And after independence, the attention shifts to feminist and women's rights discourses and post-colonial discourses that really criticize the approach, as Daniela also mentioned. In terms of setting, the temporal setting shifts from a colonial setting to more contemporary settings in more recent texts. The spatial setting, initially, a lot of them are set in rural areas, then urban Africa, and then more recently in the African diaspora in Europe, especially. The women who are initially the protagonists, so the central characters, gradually take charge of the telling of their own stories, and they become narrators or the focalizers through whose eyes the story is told. I distinguish 3 generations, and 3 generations is not meant to be taken literally. They overlap, and it's more in terms of the focus. So the first generation focuses on ethnicity, and the text really address female genital excision as an element in the colonial conflict, and they address how it's abused by the colonizers, and how the societies or the communities cling to FGE or female genital excision more radically than they would have just because it's under pressure. There is no real direct indictment of the practice, and that's really impossible in that sensitive context of decolonization. Women are accused of letting the side down. Charity Wakiyuma, who's really writing against female genital excision, has her characters say, if only they would let it die naturally, but there's building it up all the time. So the colonial attention is really seen as problematic. Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about a village or a community that's split into two sides, with the Makuyu village Christianized, really following the colonial discourse, and then the traditionalists taking the opposite side. But interesting is that he uses the exact same wording. So you have a community that is using the exact same argument to, or does the exact same wording to formulate the opposite argument. It's a Romeo and Juliet type of story, but if Shakespeare can have a facile reconciliation of his two feuding parties, there's no such thing in Ngugi's text, because it's in the context of colonization, and the story, does not end with a reconciliation of the two feuding parties. I mentioned that it's difficult to raise this as a gender concern. So even in texts like Flora and Wapa Zefuru, where the characters is really headstrong and really resists almost every single custom that is against women, or that she feels curbs her freedom, she will go along with female genital excision. So you see how the practice is really too sensitive to address in that text. So the author is very radical, except when it comes to female genital excision, and that by in itself is also already an indication. It's interesting to see that that doesn't happen. In the second generation, and we're now in the context of the UN Decade for Women, and that really means that there's a lot more attention to women writers, and also excision as an instrument in women's repression. The focus is on women's pain. It's compared to more readily recognized forms of oppression, other forms of patriarchal oppression, or even political oppression. Somebody compares, the mother-in-law who wants to excise the child to the dictator who silences the people. References to or comparisons to the slaughtering of animals. A lot of the women submit to the practice, but others are speaking out, and also on a narrative level. And this is really important, that these women are narrating their own stories, and they're conveying these stories to other women in their community. So it's an important narrative act within these texts. If we look at Sardines by Narutin Farah, we see how this character is describing how she experienced her own excision, and how she fears this for other women, and also for herself, for her own child, sorry. And if you compare that to a much earlier description by Jomo Kenyatta, then the difference is really striking. It's much more personalized reaction, whereas Kenyatta almost has, a perfect surgeon operating. So this personal perspective is really important. In the third generation, we have the focus on women's right to health. And also the West begins to function as a safe haven for the characters. And this means that the critique is an intercultural critique and no longer an intracultural critique. And I will explain why that's important. Here is an example of a Somali text where the character really sees her migration to the US as a solution for her baby, the baby that she's carrying. And she really feels that this will guarantee, a better or the right to health for her baby. So this move to the United States. But this intercultural condemnation is also quite complex, certainly more complex than the second generation's intracultural denunciation, because now the characters are superficially embracing the West as a safe haven. They're not negotiating with their own culture anymore. And also the characters who have been excised lack agency, or if they do take action, their action is very unproductive. And this is very in a huge contrast, for instance, with a woman at point zero, where the character is actually lashing out against her oppressors and ends up in jail for it. But she's lashing out, she's active, and has a lot of agency that way. Also, stereotypical and sensationalist representations. Sometimes they are repeated, merely repeated, or they can also be denounced, but they are present, and that too makes this a bit more complex. Often Alice Walker is one of those writers who's attacked for not writing with a lot of sensitivity about female genital excision. But it's interesting that precisely Walker, who devotes her entire novel to the theme, and it's not something that is a minor aspect, that she does not present the West as a safe haven. She shows how it's also practiced in the United States. So she places it on a continuum of female pain that reaches the United States as well, incorporates the United States in that indictment. And she's also rather positive about women's practical and discursive power to react. And she has a lot of narrators, and all these narrators are collectively denouncing the practice, so that the message in the novel is very much reinforced. I want to conclude with an example by a writer who's now based in Belgium, but who is from Somali and was raised in Italy as well. In her poem Strappo, which translates as rupture, the rupture is the focus is not so much on the physical excision, but on the psychological rupture that this speaker, who is intact, experiences. She was born to a European mother, and because she was born to a European mother, she wasn't excised, and as a result, she feels very different from the other women. This is a post-colonial critique on that human rights discourse that you find in that particular generation. So to conclude, if we look at the whole breadth of writing since the 1960s, we see a growing presence of African women writers, but on the whole, women and men. And somebody was asking in the chat, what can men do? Men can also write fiction. Men can, I know that Narutin Farah has often been asked, or presumed to be a woman writer because of his approach, but a lot of male writers have written about this also recently. That through literature, as opposed to maybe journalism, you can really show more of the variety and the complexity of all these African perspectives in one single text. Usually if you write a journalistic piece, then you take a position, and then it becomes, so now you really see the struggle of the characters, and it's really shown how this is not something that, there are no easy solutions, and whatever decision is made, there is always something that is lost as well. The differences in approach do not depend so much on the sex, ethnicity, or the nationality of the authors, but on the period in which they're writing. And I just want to conclude that, for me, literature is one of the very important, but one of the media contributing to the debate on excision, so not exclusively literature. People were also wondering about this in the chat. So literature by itself may not be the only medium to reach this goal. So I want to conclude with that Yoruba proverb that says many roads lead to the market, and I think literature is a very important one among many roads. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and join you again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for presenting. That was really outstanding from all the panelists. And of course, thank you also for all the audiences for listening attentively and for all the questions that you have been sending. It's quite overwhelming to choose questions. We have a lot of questions, and thank you, Dr. Elizabeth, for, of course, addressing a few of the questions that have been mentioned in the chat. Appreciate that. So I would like to turn the mic to the panelists first, if you want to add another perspective into this and maybe even raise a question within you before I pick up on the questions from our audiences. Would any one of you like to ask a question or has another perspective, suggestion, dimension, as you wish? Okay, we don't have, so maybe, yeah, okay.
There was a question about Silarion. Someone asked, I think in the Q&A, asked about how they can end FGM in the rural communities of Silarion where people are not educated. And I just wanted to share something that has been used in Uganda. I think it doesn't mean that it works everywhere, but there's been some using role models and using champions in these communities. They get people from the communities, they train them, so they become the champions to help. So maybe that is something that the person who asked the question could borrow a leaf from. Thank you.
Yes, also in relation to this question, they have been asking if there is any specific place that you would like to mention in which FGM is completely eradicated, and also if there, what kind of role literature has played or art has played, I would say. No? Did you get the question?
I can answer some of it. Am I unmuted now? This is
Yes.
Tobe. Yeah. I can answer part of the question or answer in two parts. Regarding where eradication of FGM has been most successful, doesn't serve as an example for elsewhere. Where is that? It's Israel. Because the Beta Israel, who had been living in Ethiopia, when they arrived in their migration, the women were examined by R.H. Bellmaker, who is a physician at the university in Arad. And he discovered that 47% of them had various kinds of scars on their labia or clitoris. It's number one, it revealed that there's little uniformity, even in the way that FGM is performed, at least there. So 47% had undergone genital mutilation. He examined the same women and cared for the same ethnic group and discovered that it ceased. And his hypothesis makes a good deal of sense. It was that these migrants wanted to become Israeli. That's his hypothesis. And therefore, they did not wish to continue many of the customs that they had experienced at home. One reason why FGM continues in the diaspora is for the opposite reason, that people are not necessarily willing migrants, they're economic migrants, or they find themselves elsewhere for various reasons, but it's rarely because a person comes from Senegal to France and wishes to become French. There is a psychological comfort to not only maintaining, but sometimes even taking a more focused stance with regard to what you did at home before you you depart. So it is an answer to the question, where has it died out? I should say that the Bedouin women also exercised FGM, and the same doctor with his team discovered that they had ceased as well. And they think it does have to do both with the law, but also with the law, with modernity, and with a certain attitude towards the new host country, which doesn't exist in many other locales. So that was one thing. The other part of the question, I'm forgetting what it was now. Sorry.
Okay. The other part of the question is if literature had contributed to the end.
All right, I do have an answer to that. No, I don't know another place where it has ended, but I know that the Guardian, which began as the Guardian Global Media Campaign, and then it became independent. It's now called the Global Media Campaign, and it is very promising because it tutors youth to become to use the media, to make films, to interview others, to produce radio shows, and to use all of the electronic devices that are transmitting messages of hope and abandonment. And they have art competitions as well, making billboards and things of that nature. And it's all documented. That's the interesting thing. So you can find a lot going on under Global Media Campaign run by a former star reporter from The Guardian. And it's going very well.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. But just in regarding to that, just one question. Like the Global Media Campaign, did it also include men?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think I would directly then go now to Daniella to ask for how it is in your classroom, whether the participation of men in this topic within the classroom, or what different strategies you use to include them and to encourage them to pick up on the topic.
That's a very interesting question because there were actually very few male students in these courses. Mm-hmm. It's probably because mostly literature courses are mostly attended by female students, at least in German universities, because it's like a female subject, like American studies, English studies, German studies. And then, but also in the courses that were like introductory courses, not just based on literature, very few men attended. I think one film that really helped attract the attention of men was Ousmane Sembène's Moulade. I think this film is generally working very well in the classroom because it offers a very differentiated picture of the male characters. It's not just saying, well, FGM is a patriarchal practice and all men are to be blamed, but it also, for example, focuses like on the generations of men and like the different access to power that the different men have and enjoy. And I think in that sense, the film is very successful in making men interested in the issue. So this is something that I would suggest. And in terms of fiction, I need to think about it, but generally, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between is a novel that works very well in the classroom because like all of the crucial debates between like colonialism and traditional cultures, the issue of loyalties that Evelyn Akkad has brought up and others, that can be really used very well when reading this book, this novel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would love to leave this question open because it's still also here in Ethiopia, where I am now, also in my state, Germany. This was always a topic that how to include man is still now, even today in our questions, so many different people asked. So please, thank you so much, Dr. Pierrette.
Oui.
Yes, Dr. Pierrette, thank you so much.
Oui. Alors, je voudrais dire quelque chose en incluant les hommes. Au mois de février de cette année, j'ai parrainé ici au Parlement une conférence dans ce genre-là, une visioconférence avec des hommes. Et effectivement, nous avons des organisations, nous en avons une spécialement en Allemagne, justement, à Hambourg, qui travaille avec les hommes. Et là, on était, je dois dire, moi j'étais très surprise que l'on avait des hommes de partout, surtout de pays qui ne sont jamais, disons, concernés, où on a l'impression qu'ils ne sont pas concernés. Il y avait des Afghans, des hommes afghans, des hommes qui venaient du Pakistan, de l'Indonésie. Et donc, cette organisation, Gleichen, de Hambourg, travaille avec les hommes, travaille avec les communautés en Allemagne. Et de plus en plus, il y a beaucoup d'hommes, enfin, qui ont fait ici des témoignages. Je vous dis, c'était au mois de février. Ils ont fait des témoignages en disant, nous ne voulons plus de femmes excisées. Et alors, nous faisons tout pour que cela s'arrête. Et j'ai trouvé ça extraordinaire parce que c'était, au moins pour moi, la première fois que l'on avait des hommes, je dirais des hommes qui, en fait, se sont posés eux-mêmes les questions et qui ont été vers cette organisation et qui ont dit comment pouvons-nous arrêter l'excision lorsqu'on sait qu'en Allemagne, à l'heure actuelle, cela arrive, cela se passe. Évidemment, c'est secret. On sait que les communautés Bremen, Hambourg, ce sont les communautés qui sont touchées et qui font venir. Alors, on a exactement ce qui se passait en France dans les années 70, qu'on fait venir en Allemagne des femmes qui excisent. Les jeunes filles, évidemment, il y a un espèce de voile là-dessus et personne ne dit rien. C'est pour ça qu'il y a eu donc cette fameuse lettre de protection qui a été donc faite avec cette organisation. Moi, je trouve aussi, en littérature, on a il y a eu un grand pas entre les premières œuvres écrites par les hommes et à partir des années 80, les œuvres qui ont été écrites par les femmes. Et même dans ce cas-là, on voit aussi une grande discrépance entre, par exemple, si on prend Tu t'appelleras Tanga de Calix Beyala en 1988, et si on prend On m'a volé mon enfance de 2006 de Diary Touba. Alors, c'est exactement là où la littérature devient... Alors, okay. Donc, je vais donner la parole aux autres en tant que mon assistante dit il n'y a plus que 8 minutes. Bon, comme tout le monde, vous savez, nous travaillons tous sur la littérature et quand on commence, on ne peut plus s'arrêter. Mais nous allons publier tout ce que vous nous avez dit. C'était très intéressant. Yeah. Sinon, je risque de trop parler. Et je voudrais surtout vous écouter, avoir votre opinion et aussi le public, avoir aussi les questions du public.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now that our time is going, I would like to pick up a very hot question that has been trending in Twitter and in different forms of media the last couple of years. There has come a lot of people who argue FGM is actually a tradition and not a mutilation. So whoever who has a very interesting view on this, I would like to raise this question for. Please go ahead and answer. So FGM is a tradition, not a mutilation. What do you guys think about this? Who would like to go and answer this? Ruhina, Shiro, anybody, or Elizabeth? Yeah. Anyone?
I just want to say what I think about it is less important than what the writers say about it in this session, I would say. I find it very interesting to see that a lot of the writers really raise this issue, that, you know, it is a tradition and the people who practice it don't practice it because they think, oh, let's hurt my child. So and this is also something that you see in the text, that, you know, this conflict between the people who oppose the practice in the literary text are fighting mothers and grandmothers who are not practicing the rite because they want to hurt the child. And in some texts, it's really shown very well how the wording of the grandmother is the exact same wording as the daughter who's writing it. They're saying, I'm doing it in the best interest. And this really shows the complexity of it. And I think it's you know, the writers really show that it's not something that is black and white. It's not something that you can just say it's this or that. It's very complex, and the fight is very complex. The struggle is very complex. And you can install a law and you can teach it in a classroom, but just doing this by yourself, the law is not going to help. it's one factor, but it's talking to the men, it's talking to the grandmothers, it's talking to the children, so it's really it involves everyone. And I think a lot of the writers really show this very well, how, you know, it's something that concerns the entire community. And, you know, the text for me where it works best is where within the text, the character, the main character, is engaging the community and pointing out to the community what the problem is, rather than, you know, zooming off to Europe and escaping the problem. But really within the community, addressing this and saying, you know, we need to talk about this, we need to engage with this collectively. And I'll stop.
Yes, all right. Thank you very much. And yeah, it's also my experience actually. And in regarding to this, I mean, it's not only that people argue that this is traditional, but for the fact that people argue that this is also religious, we have, I mean, in my fight against FGM, we have mobilized lots of religion leaders and influencers in standing against the practice, and to say, hey, it's not my religion, it's not my culture, it's not my tradition. So I think those kind of involving highly influential people from religion as well as from the cultural aspect together in dialogue has helped, at least from what I saw. But if anyone has another perspective on this, I would like to give you. All right, okay.
Yes.
Evelyn?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think I already addressed this problem with loyalty versus truth or whatever. I wanted to also add that I have been touring Africa and the Middle East after my concern about this problem and questioning men, women, doctors. And I found out that very often many men are more against it sometimes than women in many communities. And that the women say, I have gone through it myself, why shouldn't she? You know, there is this, and often they wait for their husband to be traveling to excise their daughters. And so I have, you know, raised all of these questions because it's a very, very complicated issue. And if we don't educate and we don't, you know, through music, through singing, through culture, through art, through activism, you know, I would like also to mention here Fran Hosken, who is one of the first ones who did a fantastic job in raising awareness. I don't know if she's still alive, but her books are worth reading.
Thank you very much. So thank you. I think the very concrete question that comes again and again is still strong men's involvement in the topic is very, very important. So I would like to ask Ruhina from the ground what her experience is in men's involvement, and if she wants to say further in the question that we have asked earlier, which because of we couldn't hear you, so we proceeded, and let's use the time for that. Ruhina, yes, thank you. Did you understand the question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. It is often said that men have no role in this. This is women's work, and they do not know. They are not involved in it, but they are 100% involved in it. They know the things, but they do not try to understand the pain of women. They think it is just a normal thing, thing of. It's very common among women that they will undergo this practice, and they will bear the pain for a lifetime. But this is their thinking, and they think it's normal, but it's not normal. That we can understand here, all the people here and the people who are watching, we can understand that it's not normal. It's simply a child abuse and a human rights violation, which must be addressed with joined hands with men and women. So not women should come forward to eradicate the practice. Here men have a significant role to do so far I can understand. This kind of thing is also being conveyed by writer Kat Wardier. Yes, Wardier's Kat. I have forgotten the full name. One woman's fight in Britain today, right, Tobe? So she has expressed in her memoir that yes, men have an important role in this process, in the eradication process. She also gave an example in the memoir. We find his her husband Yusuf. He was so helpful that and because of his help, she could go forward and she could involve in activism. And in the case of Khabi Koiter's blood stains, that was translated by Tobe Levin, right? So there we see a different scenario. There, Khabi's husband didn't help him. He used to abuse her, and he used to exploit her in many ways throughout her life. So he was not a supportive husband, unlike Wardier's husband Yusuf. So because
thank you so much. I think our time is kindly. I would like to remind you that our time is towards the end. So I might kindly interrupt you. And thank you so much. Apologize for that. I would like to ask Sachiko if she has something to say, and then we can wrap up the panel and thank the audience and also the panelists as well as the host, because we only have 1 minute. And Shahiko, do you have anything to say really briefly before we end up?
Oh, okay. I just want to say thank you for all for having me to join this opportunity. So yeah, that's a lot to learn for me. Thank you.
All right.
Alors, je voudrais donc conclure. Oui. Alors donc je dirais tout simplement pour conclure, tout d'abord, merci beaucoup aux intervenantes, au public, c'était très intéressant. Et je dirais que pour lutter contre l'excision, contre les mutilations génitales féminines, un travail interdisciplinaire s'impose, qui pourra déclencher un nouveau discours. On a besoin de toutes ces autobiographies, de toutes ces biographies écrites par des femmes, écrites par des hommes, afin que nous puissions un jour nous dire, nous avons réussi notre combat. Les mutilations génitales féminines ont disparu, ou du moins n'ont plus lieu à cette grande échelle. Je vous remercie de tout cœur pour votre présence, c'était très intéressant, c'était très passionnant, et comme je l'ai dit, nous allons publier vos textes, et on vous demande aussi de nous les envoyer afin que ça puisse se faire assez vite. Merci beaucoup au public qui était là, j'espère que vous avez pu poser vos questions, je viens de le dire. Oui. Oui, donc nous avons donc toutes ces biographies, je viens de dire ma conclusion, tous ces destins brisés dont on nous a parlé, et aussi de se dire qu'il reste encore aujourd'hui 3 millions de femmes à protéger et qu'à travers la littérature, peut-être nous arriverons à y parvenir. Merci beaucoup pour votre temps, merci beaucoup à la modératrice, à tout le monde, merci. Et je vous souhaite une bonne soirée. Merci beaucoup. N'oubliez pas de nous faire parvenir vos textes. Merci.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Et je crois que nous devons, avant de partir, je tiens à remercier les interprètes et je souhaiterais qu'elles se montrent un instant. Peut-on voir les interprètes qui nous ont accompagnés durant ce temps? Voilà nos 2 interprètes, René et Marianne. Merci beaucoup pour le travail que vous avez effectué. Merci bien. Voilà. Au revoir. Et je pense que quelqu'un veut faire encore une dernière photo. Tu fais encore une photo? Oui, avec tout le monde, cette fois-ci avec les interprètes y compris. Tobias, vous êtes en ligne? Voilà, ok. Voilà, merci bien et bonne soirée.
Ok, bonne soirée.